Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us on this webinar, held as part of the Victorian Building Authority's Practitioner Education Series. My name's Luke Hamblin, Team Lead of the Technical and Regulation Building Team, and I'll be your host for today. Today's webinar is on siting, and we'll have a runtime of roughly 60 minutes. Please note this is a hybrid webinar that combines live streaming of the learning content with interactive polls and Q&As answered by our technical team. So I encourage you all to please type your questions into the Q&A chat function during the live streaming and also participate in the live poll. Any questions that we do not get to, we'll take away and collate responses to those and publish on our website, as well as email all the participants who registered for the event. We really appreciate you all taking the time to join us today and further progress your professional development. We hope there's some takeaways for practitioners of all experience levels. We will now begin the webinar. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to the elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people attending the session today. Today you'll be hearing from Christian Williams. Christian is a Senior Technical Advisor with the Technical and Regulation Building Team. He has been with the VBA for 10 years. Christian has over 30 years experience in the building industry and has extensive knowledge, experience, qualifications in building construction, building surveying and fire safety engineering. As Victoria's building and plumbing regulator, the VBA is committed to ensuring a safe, confident and thriving industry and collaborates with stakeholders to enhance practitioner capability and conduct to protect consumers' interests. We have a role in ensuring practitioners understand how to do things correctly, maintaining the integrity of the building and plumbing industries. We provide general advice about applying the building and plumbing standards and the regulation of building and plumbing work. We publish material to assist carrying out of functions under the Building Act and the relevant regulations where regulations are unclear or ambiguous. We do not publish material that is reproduced, the regulatory requirements, or provide specific compliance solutions. We don't set the policy, but we support the industry to understand and comply with the rules. The VBA's scope covers guidance and interpretation of the Building Act, building and plumbing regulations, the NCC and the Australian standards. What's not in scope for the VBA is policy-related issues, legislation that is still to be implemented, and educational resources that are not for the purpose of providing technical content. Now, before we begin, I'd like to let you know that this session is being recorded and the link to this presentation will be made available on the VBA website along with our previous webinars. If time permits, we'll be answering some of your pre-submitted questions during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Please still submit your questions via the Q&A chat function during the webinar, as the technical team is available to answer your questions in the chat room. At the end of the webinar, we will collate all the unanswered questions and we'll provide an answer to as many of these as possible. A copy of the Q&A will be sent out in the following weeks. Also, during the webinar, we will be conducting live polls that will automatically appear on your screens. Please participate in these. Please also feel free to scan the QR code with your phone when they appear on the slides to direct yourself to the relevant websites relating to the topic being presented today. We will do our best to answer as many of your questions as we can during this webinar. However, we receive a large volume of questions and we may not have time to answer your question during the webinar. After this webinar, we will collate all the unanswered questions and we'll provide an answer to as many of these as possible. A copy of these questions and answers will be sent out in the weeks following this webinar. Christian, I'll now hand over to you.
Good morning all, and thank you for attending this webinar, and I hope you find it of some assistance. Due to time constraints, the information we'll be presenting is limited and we won't be covering each and every building regulation, and will instead be providing some guidance on applying the siting requirements, as well as providing some specifics on regulations we frequently get asked about. We understand there may be many more questions on how specific siting regulations are applied. However, I once again confirm that we will be answering your questions submitted during registration for this webinar and any relevant questions that our technical advisors can't answer during the session. This will be done in the form of Q&A fact sheets that will be released in the coming weeks. We note the importance of this webinar as it will provide guidance on the application of siting regulations and clarify some of the requirements for the siting of Class 1 buildings. After this webinar, you should have enhanced your knowledge in applying the siting requirements of the regulations. So what we will cover in this presentation will first of all be what is siting, requirements relating to applying Part 5 of the building regulations, how Schedule 6 of the regulations applies, a little on report and consent, then we'll discuss some specific siting requirements, followed by some answers to some of your questions you submitted during registration of the webinar. So to start us off, we're going to discuss siting and what it is for those who may be unaware. So what is siting? Siting refers to specific restrictions on the use of a land, allotment or site. These restrictions are put in place to protect the preferred neighbourhood character, minimise the impact from newly constructed dwellings and protect the amenity of the surrounding properties. The regulations consider matters such as the placement of the building on an allotment in terms of the site coverage, the distance from allotment boundaries, and the height of the building, etc. It also considers matters such as overlooking into adjoining properties, overshadowing of adjoining property, provision of daylight, car parking, and required garden areas, amongst others such as placement of sheds and fences. We'll now move on to discuss a few matters relating to how the siting requirements of Part 5 are applied. Part 5 of the regulations contains requirements for siting matters that apply to the construction of single Class 1 buildings, Class 10A buildings and Class 10B structures, as defined under the National Construction Code or NCC, and also for small second dwellings or SSDs as they're commonly referred to. The regulations define an SSD as being a Class 1 building that is self-contained and has a gross floor area that is equal to or less than 60 square metres, that is on the same allotment as an existing building, that is a single Class 1 building, that is not a small second dwelling. We will be presenting a webinar on small second dwellings in August for those who wish to know more about them. You can also refer to Practice Note SI03, Small Second Dwellings, which outlines the requirements specific to SSDs and will be published on the VBA website in the coming weeks. The requirements in Part 5 are equivalent to those under the Victorian planning schemes and specifically Clause 54 of the Victorian Planning Provisions or the VPP. However, Part 5 of the building regulations does not apply where there is a planning permit required for the construction of the building and the relevant planning scheme regulates the same matters under the regulations. Many of these regulations refer to an existing building or dwelling on the adjoining allotment, which is defined under Regulation 69 as being a building that existed complete before the 1st of July 1994, that has an occupancy permit which Council has a copy of, where there is a certificate of final inspection but only where an occupancy permit is not required, or that was completed and can be occupied without an occupancy permit or certificate of final inspection. There is also a definition for single dwelling under the regulations, which means a Class 1 building and any Class 10 building associated with the Class 1 building. The other thing to consider under Part 5 of the regulations is whether the proposed building is to be constructed in what is known as an approved building envelope, in accordance with Regulation 71. Approved building envelopes are typically on title and are defined under the regulations as being documented design parameters that deal with the siting manner under Part 5 that are specified in a planning permit for the subdivision of land on or after the 1st of July 1994 and either made an agreement under Section 173 of the Planning and Environment Act 1987, or shown as restrictions on the certified plan of subdivision, which is on the transfer of land register. An approved building envelope will override the citing matters under Part 5 of the regulations, where an approved envelope applies to the allotment and it deals with the same citing matter as the regulation, and the design of the building is consistent with the approved envelope in relation to that citing matter. The figure on the slide is a basic example of an approved building envelope. However, not all plans showing approved building envelopes will look the same. This example shows a detail from a plan of subdivision with a hatched section that applies to the allotment. The hatched area is an approved building envelope that regulates the side setback and front street setback on the allotment. If the building is constructed within this hatched area, the setback requirements of the approved building envelope will apply instead of the setback provisions under Part 5 of the building regulations. For more information on approved building envelopes, please refer to Practice Note SI02, Building Envelopes, by scanning the QR code or using the link on the screen. We now have a short quiz for you, with the first question being, where an occupancy permit is required, a building is considered existing if a certificate of final inspection has been issued. True or false? Question 2. An approved building envelope overrides the citing requirements under Part 5 of the Building Regulations 2018. True or false? Let's see how you go. Question 1, the correct answer is B, false. It's an occupancy permit. Answer to question 2, the correct answer is A, true. In this part of the session, we will discuss the citing requirements with respect to Schedule 6 of the Building Regulations 2018. So far, we have discussed the application of Part 5 and how where a planning permit is required that regulates the same citing matter under Part 5 does not apply. However, there are some cases where the planning scheme regulates the same citing matter where a planning permit is not required, but the planning scheme requirements must still be used in lieu of Part 5. This is because there are some regulations that call up Schedule 6 of the Building Regulations. Schedule 6 specifies particular planning schemes that where the zone to that planning scheme has a schedule that specifies particular citing provisions, those provisions become a building regulation and must be complied with instead of what is specified under Part 5. The intent of Schedule 6 is to allow councils to specify their own particular citing restrictions to suit their municipality and its preferred neighbourhood character. The particular regulations that are affected by the planning schemes under Schedule 6 are Regulations 74.1, Maximum Street Setback, 75.1, Building Height, 76.1, Site Coverage, 76A, Minimum Garden Area, 77.1, Permeability, 79.1, Side and Rear Setbacks, 80, Sub-Regulation 2, Wall and Carports on Boundaries, 86.1, Private Open Space, and 89.1, Front Fence Height. We will discuss some of these regulations in more detail later on in the session. While the particular planning schemes and affected regulations are listed in Schedule 6 of the Building Regulations, the exact siting restriction still needs to be determined. In order to determine this, the VBA suggests obtaining advice from counsel in writing as to what the exact restrictions are. Alternatively, you can access the planning schemes online to determine what the restrictions are. We're now going to do something a little different and show you a short video on how you can access these requirements online by using the QR code or link on the bottom left of your screen. We're now going to show you how you can access the planning scheme requirements under the schedule to the zone for the planning scheme that's specified under Schedule 6 for a particular allotment that you're considering. So if you use the QR code on the left side of the screen or the link, it'll bring you to this website, which is www.planning.vic.gov.au/planning schemes. Now, this is the home page of that website, and if you scroll down, you'll see a number of windows. The window on the right hand side says Planning Property Report. We'll click on that one. That'll allow you to search for a planning property report for a particular allotment. For our purposes, I'm just going to pluck an address out of the sky. I'll just say number 10 and use my surname, which is Williams, and we'll choose 10 Williams Avenue, Churchill, and that will allow us to download a copy of the planning property report for that particular allotment. So we'll download a copy of this report. This report gives you a number of requirements specified under the planning scheme. The first page shows you what the zones are. So you can see marked in red, that's our particular allotment, which is 10 Williams Avenue, Churchill. And underneath the heading of planning zones, there's two links. One to the general residential zone and one to the general residential zone Schedule 1. Because the requirements we're looking for apply in the schedules, that's the link that we're going to choose. So if we click on the link to the schedule, that should bring up the requirements for that particular planning scheme. This particular planning scheme is the Latrobe planning scheme, so City of Latrobe. If we scroll down, we'll start to come to some requirements. That one's just an exemption from the minimum garden area under the planning scheme. So in that case, Part 5 of the building regulations will apply, and we will be applying those minimum garden requirements as per Part 5. This table here relates to clauses 54 and 55, 54 relating to the construction of a single dwelling. So we can actually zoom up on that table, which we'll do. And this table will specify the requirements for that site under that schedule. So you can see here, there's nothing specified for minimum street setback, nothing specified for site coverage, and nothing specified for permeability. In that case, for those three matters, the siting requirements of Part 5 will apply because there's nothing specified in the schedule. But if we scroll down further, we can see there's a requirement for side and rear setbacks specified under the schedule, which is 1.5 metres, which is an increase of 500 millimetres over the Part 5 of the building regulations. Because this is a specification in the schedule to the zone that applies under Schedule 6 of our building regulations, it then becomes a building regulation, and that's what must apply. We scroll down further, we can see there's no requirement for walls on boundaries and no requirements for private open space, in which case Part 5 of the building regulations will apply. However, there is a requirement for front fence heights, which is 1.2 metres, and that's what will need to be applied under the building regulations, 1.2 metres. So there's no further requirements under that table. There's nothing specified for maximum building height and no other requirements specified under that schedule. Therefore, it's only those two items in the table that are applicable, which is the side and rear setbacks and the front fence height, that must be applied to the dwelling in accordance with this schedule. Everything else will need to comply with Part 5. It's as simple as that. Some of you who are switched on may have noticed that there was an error in what was said in the previous video relating to the exemption for minimum garden area in the schedule to the zone in the City of Latrobe's planning scheme, as seen on the left. The video had an error introduced stating that Part 5 of the building regulations applies. This cannot be the case, as Regulation 76A is different to other regulations under Part 5 in that it's reliant on the minimum garden area requirement being specified in the zone to the planning scheme, as can be seen from the application of the regulation under Regulation 76A1 on the right of the screen, and there is otherwise no other requirement under Regulation 76A. Therefore, in this particular case, the garden area requirement under Regulation 76A does not apply, as there is an exemption to the requirement under the City of Latrobe's planning scheme. So we come to quiz time again. First question of the quiz. Schedule 6 of the Building Regulations 2018 applies where A, a planning permit is required, or B, there is a non-compliance with the regulation under Part 5, or C, the schedule to the zone of the planning scheme regulates the same matter under Part 5. Question 2. Schedule 6 of the Building Regulations 2018 overrides the regulations under Part 5. A, at all times. B, only where the schedule to the zone in the planning scheme regulates the same matter under Part 5. Or C, where there is a non-compliance with the regulation under Part 5. Let's see how you go again. The answer to question 1, the correct answer is C. The schedule to the zone of the planning scheme regulates the same matter under Part 5. For question 2, the correct answer is B. Only where the schedule to the zone in the planning scheme regulates the same matter. Another thing that may need to be considered in relation to the siding regulations is gaining the report and consent of the relevant council, which we'll now discuss. There are a number of prescribed matters for which the report and consent of the relevant council must be obtained in relation to an application for a building permit under Part 2 of Schedule 5 of the Building Regulations. Many of these matters relate to the siding of buildings and structures under Part 5. Most siding regulations require the report and consent of the council where compliance with the regulation is not achieved, excluding Regulation 76A for minimum garden area and Regulation 93, fences must not include barbed wire. Report and consent is also required where the matters listed under Schedule 6 of the regulations have not been complied with, but does not include any siting matters approved under a planning permit. Report and consent must be applied for prior to the issue of a building permit, as council are unable to issue a retrospective report and consent. When assessing an application for report and consent, council will use Ministerial Guideline MG12 to assist in their decision making, which can be seen on the right of the screen. The applicant for a report and consent may wish to use MG12 to assist them in determining whether the proposed design will satisfy council. In addition to MG12, council will usually also consult with the affected adjoining property owners to determine if there are any valid objections to the application for report and consent. It's important to note that where a building permit has already been issued and a non-compliance with a siting regulation is found, a report and consent cannot be obtained. Alternatively, the relevant building surveyor can take enforcement action in the form of a building notice, or the applicant for the building permit can make an application to the Building Appeals Board to modify the particular regulation in accordance with Section 160 of the Building Act 1993. We once again have a quick quiz for you. Question 1. A report and consent is not required where there is a non-compliance with siting provisions called up by Schedule 6 of the Building Regulations 2018. True or false? Question 2. Report and consent is required where there is a non-compliance with the siting requirement under a planning permit. True or false? Answer to question 1. The correct answer is B. False. A report and consent is required. Question 2. The correct answer is also B. False. Report and consent is not required where there is a non-compliance with the planning permit. We'll now go into some of the siting regulations under Part 5 of the Building Regulations 2018 and provide some guidance in their application. Again, we will not be going to cover each and every siting regulation, just the ones we've received more queries on. The first regulation we will discuss will be Regulation 73, Maximum Street Setback. This regulation restricts the maximum distance a building may be set back from the front street alignment to not more than 1/3 the depth of the allotment, with the intent of discouraging principal dwellings being constructed to the rear of allotments and to maintain the preferred streetscape. The front street alignment is the boundary line between the allotment and the front street. Street is defined under the regulations and includes road, carriageway, lane, footway, highway, square, court, alley and right-of-way. Regulation 73 does not apply to small second dwellings. Regulation 74 restricts the minimum distance that a Class 1 building may be set back from a street alignment to preserve the preferred streetscape and make efficient use of the site. The figures on the slide and many of the following slides are examples from Practice Note PN 47 and under the new Practice Note Naming Convention SI01, which will be released in the coming weeks. This particular slide shows how the setback should be determined for a corner allotment and a court type scenario. The diagrams and associated calculation methods can be accessed from the practice note from the VBA website. The minimum street setback is measured within 90 degrees or less from the wall of a building that is facing the street. However, Regulation 74 specifically excludes a lane, footway, alley or right-of-way. There are some scenarios where there is more than one street around an allotment, such as a corner allotment as shown on the left of the screen, or an allotment with a street at both the front and rear of the allotment, as shown on the right of the screen. So how do you determine which is the front street alignment in these cases? Well, in these cases, it's typically the wall of the building that presents as the architectural frontage of the building that is considered the front wall of the building and is therefore where the front street setback should be taken from. There are a number of allowable encroachments listed under Regulation 74.3, which may encroach into the minimum street setback to a maximum distance of 2.5 metres. These consist of porches, verandas and pergolas that have a maximum height of less than 3.6 metres above natural ground level. Eaves, fascias and gutters, sun blinds and shade sails, permanent and fixed screens referred to in Regulation 84, decks, steps or landings less than 800 mils in height, and note that the setback is once again taken from the front wall of the building and is not to be taken from an encroachment such as a balcony or a veranda. Regulation 75 restricts the maximum height of a building with the intent of preventing excessively bulky and tall buildings from being constructed. It permits a maximum building height of 9 metres. However, where the site of the slope of the natural ground level of the site is 2.5 degrees at any cross-section that is wider than 8 metres, a maximum height of 10 metres is permitted, as shown in the figure on the screen. So how is the maximum height measured? The regulations define height in terms of a building as being the vertical distance between the natural ground level and the top of the roof covering. This means that the maximum height of the building must not be exceeded at any point measured between the natural ground level and the top of the roof. Chimneys, flues and service pipes are not included when measuring the building height. So what is natural ground level then? Unfortunately, natural ground level or NGL is not defined under the regulations. Natural ground level is taken as a level typically as being natural undisturbed ground. However, where there's a new subdivision has had reshaping earthworks, the new levels may be taken as the natural ground level. This is provided that the adjoining allotments across the development have also been subject to the same earthworks or are at the same level. Sometimes it may be difficult to determine where natural ground level is. For example, where the subject allotment has had cut and fill earthworks. In these cases, natural ground level may be taken as being the line across the allotment that connects any 2 points within the allotment or adjoining allotments that can reasonably be considered natural ground level as shown in the figure on the screen. The next regulation we will discuss will be Regulation 79, Side and Rear Setbacks. The purpose of Regulation 79 is to provide adequate separation between the proposed building and the buildings on adjoining allotments, particularly above ground floor level. The figure you can see on your screen shows the setback envelope in accordance with Regulation 79. The envelope starts at a point of 1 metre from a side or rear boundary to a maximum height of 3.6 metres at that point. The higher the building is, the further the building must be set back from the boundary. The setback is required to be increased by 1 metre plus an additional 300 millimetres for every metre of height over 3.6 metres and up to 6.9 metres in height. Where over 6.9 metres in height, the building must be set back 2 metres plus an additional 1 metre for every metre of height above 6.9 metres in height. However, whatever the case may be, the maximum building height under Regulation 75 must not be exceeded without first obtaining a report and consent from the Council. It is also important to note that where the wall of a building complies with Regulation 80, the provisions of Regulation 79 are not applicable. There are also a number of allowable encroachments into the setback under Regulation 79, which consist of the following elements that may fully encroach into the required setback unless otherwise specified. Landings not more than 2 square metres and less than 1 metre in height, unroofed stairways and ramps, pergolas, shade sails, eaves, fascias and gutters up to 600 millimetres, and carports that comply with Regulation 80. We'll discuss Regulation 80 in the next section. There are also a number of allowable encroachments that may encroach 500 millimetres into the required setback, including porches and verandas, masonry chimneys, sun blinds, permanent and fixed screens referred to in Regulation 84, flues, pipes and rain heads, domestic fuel tanks and water tanks, and heating and cooling equipment and other services. In addition to the height and length requirements under Regulation 80 for walls and carports on or within 200 mils of the boundary, which applies parallel to the boundary, there are also height restrictions for the building perpendicular to the boundary under Regulation 75(3) that affect the wall under Regulation 80. Perpendicular, meaning at right angles to the boundary. The figure on the screen shows the height restriction, which is that the height of the building must not exceed 3.6 metres for a distance of 1 metre taken perpendicular to the boundary, measured from the top of the wall to the 1 metre point. Regulation 81 ensures that adequate daylight is provided to existing habitable room windows of a dwelling on an adjoining allotment. It provides for a light court with a minimum dimension of 1 metre perpendicular to the boundary, with a minimum area of 3 square metres. The dimensions of this light court must be measured clear to the sky. The term clear to the sky is defined under the regulations and means an unroofed area or an area roofed with a material that transmits at least 90% of light, such as laser light roofing. Regulation 80 protects the amenity of adjoining properties by regulating the height and length of walls that are proposed to be on or within 200 mils of an allotment boundary, or carports within 1 metre of a boundary. As shown in the figure on the left of the screen, this regulation restricts the height of walls on a boundary to an average height of 3.2 metres and a maximum height of 3.6 metres, excluding any part that's 2 metres in height. It also restricts the length of the wall or a carport to 10 metres plus 25% of the remaining length of the boundary, as shown in the figure on the right of the screen. It's important to note, however, that where a proposed wall or carport abuts an existing wall or carport on the adjoining allotment, the wall or the carport may be built to the same height as the existing wall or carport. This basically means the proposed and existing wall or carport will share the same part of the boundary. In addition to the requirement for a light court, where a wall or carport with an average height of more than 3 metres opposite a habitable room window in an existing dwelling on an adjoining allotment, it must be set back from that window at least half the height of the wall or carport if the wall or carport is within a 55-degree angle in the horizontal plane through the centre of the window, and may be swung on a 35-degree angle as shown on the figures in the screen. Regulation 82 ensures that adequate sunlight is provided for north-facing windows which are orientated towards the boundary in an existing building on an adjoining allotment for passive solar heating. Where the new dwelling will be within 3 metres of the existing habitable room window, the proposed building must be set back for at least 3 metres from either side of the window, or that part of the window that is within 3 metres, as shown in the figure on the screen. Similar to Regulation 75, this envelope starts at a point of 1 metre from the boundary facing the window to a maximum height of 3.6 metres at that point. The setback is required to be increased by 1 metre plus an additional 600 millimetres for every metre of height over 3.6 metres up to 6.9 metres in height. Where over 6.9 metres in height, the building must be set back 3 metres plus an additional 1 metre for every metre in height above 6.9 metres. Note that the 3 metre distance from the window is to be measured from the face of the glass itself and not from the frame of the window, brick reveals, external claddings or mouldings. Regulation 82 only applies where the window or part of a window is below the eaves or parapet of the building. Therefore, windows at upper levels or on sloping sites are not required to be considered under this regulation. There are also a number of allowable encroachments under Regulation 82 that are permitted to encroach up to 500 millimetres into the setback to a maximum height of 2.5 metres, consisting of flues and pipes, domestic fuel tanks and water tanks, heating and cooling equipment, and other services. In addition, a rainhead may encroach 500 millimetres into the setback. What is also important to note about north-facing windows is that a reference to north is a reference to true north, not magnetic north, and applies as shown in the figure in the screen. Regulation 83 protects the sunlight available to recreational private open space, or RPOS, on adjoining allotments from overshadowing by a new dwelling or extension to a dwelling. This regulation requires that a minimum area of sunlight be provided to the recreational private open space on the adjoining allotment, which is a lesser of 40 square metres with a minimum dimension of 3 metres, as shown in the example on the screen, or 75% of the existing recreational private open space, whichever is the lesser. Recreational private open space is defined under the regulations and means any part of a private open space in an allotment which is at the side of the or rear of an existing dwelling, including a small second dwelling on the allotment, or within the front setback of an existing dwelling, including a small second dwelling on the allotment, and which is screened for at least 90% of its perimeter by a wall, fence, or other barrier that is at least 1.5 metres high and has no more than 25% of its area open, and which is primarily used for outdoor recreational activities. Private open space is also defined under the regulations and means an unroofed area of land, or a deck, terrace, patio, balcony, pergola, veranda, gazebo, swimming pool or spa. Note that recreational private open space does not include driveways, dedicated clothesline areas, dedicated bin areas and other service areas, as they are not used for recreational purposes. What you can see on your screen depicts an existing dwelling on an adjoining allotment on the right and a proposed dwelling on the left. The shadows cast are shown from the 6-hour period from 9 AM till 3 PM, including the shadows cast from the existing building itself and the existing structures on the site, including the boundary fence. It's important to note that where the recreational private open space already doesn't have the required sunlight prior to the construction of the proposed building or extension between the hours of 9 AM and 3 PM on the 22nd of September, that the sunlight to the recreational private open space must not be further reduced at all during the full 6-hour period. In addition, it's also important to note that when considering overshadowing, that you exclude the shadows cast by any structures that would fit the definition of recreational private open space. Therefore, as you can see in this example, the shadows cast by the veranda and the gazebo have been excluded, as they meet this definition. This is because Regulation 83 requires consideration of the shadows cast by the proposed building and other buildings and structures on the site. However, it does not require the shadow cast by a recreational private open space on the recreational private open space. The final regulation we're going to cover will be Regulation 84, which relates to overlooking. The purpose of this regulation is to protect existing habitable room windows and secluded private open space on adjoining allotments from overlooking where there is a direct line of sight from a habitable room window in a proposed building or from a raised open space, such as a decking. Raised open space is defined under Regulation 84.10 and means a landing with an area of more than 2 metres squared, a balcony, a terrace, a deck or a patio. Secluded private open space is also defined under Regulation 84.10 and means any part of a private open space on an allotment which is screened for at least 90% of its perimeter by a wall, fence or other barrier that is at least 1.5 metres high, that has no more than 25% of its area open, and which is primarily intended for outdoor recreational activities. With respect to where there is a direct line of sight into a habitable room window on the adjoining allotment, the line of sight is taken from 1.7 metres from the floor of the room with the window out at a 45-degree angle from either side of the window, being considered for overlooking. The distance of the line of sight is restricted to 9 metres. Therefore, any habitable room windows that fall within this distance below the 1.75 metre high line of sight would not comply with this regulation. And as you can see in this figure, in this example, is non-compliant. You can also see that the line of sight applies horizontally and the fence is blocking the line of sight from the ground floor. Furthermore, the line of sight does not apply to looking upward, such as from the first floor window of the proposed building to the first floor window of the existing building in the figure. Where a habitable room window is overlooking the existing habitable room window on the adjoining allotment, Regulation 84.5 has prescriptive provisions that, if complied with, will render the proposed window compliant. These provisions are where the edge of the proposed habitable room window is offset a minimum of 1.5 metres from the edge of the existing habitable room window on the adjoining allotment, as you can see in the figure, where the proposed window has a sill height of at least 1.7 metres above floor level, if the proposed window has obscure glazing in any part of the window below 1.75 metres above floor level, or where the direct line of sight is obscured by a permanent and fixed screen that has no more than 25% of its area open. Fixed typically meaning that the screen cannot be removed without the use of a tool. The same type of screen may be used to achieve compliance, where a raised open space is overlooking a habitable room window or secluded private open space. Obscure windows or windows with screens may be openable, provided the opening does not permit a direct line of sight, as noted in the previous slide. This figure shows how the line of sight applies for overlooking of secluded private open space. Again, the line of sight starts at 1.7 metres height from the floor of the room with a window or from a raised open space, and out 45 degrees from either side of the window. However, the difference with overlooking of secluded private open space is that the line of sight runs from the 1.7 metres height point at the proposed window and then runs downward to the point where it hits 9 metres and does not apply horizontally like with the overlooking of habitable room windows. Any area within the secluded private open space of the adjoining allotment below that line that is not obstructed from view in accordance with Regulation 84 would be considered non-compliant. We have another quick quiz. Question 1. What is the maximum distance a building can be set back from the front street alignment under Regulation 73? A. 6 metres, B. 1/3 the depth of the allotment, or C. 40% of the allotment. Question 2. Where an adjoining allotment does not already have the required amount of sunlight under Regulation 83, how much more sunlight to the recreational private open space can be reduced? A. May not be reduced at all between 9 AM and 3 PM. B. May overshadow the sunlight if not further reduced for 5 hours, example between 9 AM and 2 PM, or C, may be further reduced at any time between 9 AM and 3 PM if there are existing structures such as verandas or gazebos on the adjoining allotment. The answer to question 1, the correct answer is B, 1/3 the depth of the allotment. Answer to question 2, the correct answer is A, may not be reduced at all between 9 AM and 3 PM. To finish off the session today, a brief section on building permits. This section is basically a reminder for designers and builders that the plans that are submitted to the relevant building surveyor for approval must contain all relevant details to demonstrate compliance with the siting requirements of Part 5 of the building regulations. This would include, for example, matters such as showing the lines of sight for overlooking and providing shadow diagrams showing overshadowing of adjoining property from the proposed building and any existing buildings and structures on the subject allotments for the full time period from 9 AM till 3 PM. You'll be surprised quite often how the plans don't show the lines of sight for overlooking, or do not show the shadows in certain areas, or do not show the shadows for the full 6-hour period. So today we've discussed what siding is, learned how Part 5 of the building regulations applies, how planning schemes relate to building regulations, and gained an understanding of the requirements for a number of specific siding regulations. With that said, I'll now reintroduce you to your host Luke Hamblin to guide us through to the end of the webinar.
Okay, thanks, Christian. And that concludes our learning content section of the webinar. We'll now answer a couple of pre-submitted questions. But before we do, please note that in conjunction with this webinar, we'll be releasing an updated practice note on siding. It's currently going through the final stages of approval and hopefully be available on our website as soon as next week. Also noticed a lot of really great questions and critiques of our webinar, which the ones we haven't got to, we'll be collating all of those responses and sending out to you in an email as well. And also a lot of questions relating to second small dwellings. So just Christian touched on it, but just a reminder, there's going to be a second small dwellings webinar on the 1st of August, which will hopefully address a lot of those questions. And we'll also be publishing a practice note on SSDs also. Okay, so now we'll jump into some pre-submitted questions. So question 1, do you need to consider Regulation 79 setbacks and Regulation 80 walls on boundaries for an underground basement?
Good question. Thanks to the attendee who sent that in. Simple answer to this is yes, you need to consider it. These regulations use the word building, therefore it applies to the whole building, whether or not it's underground. Therefore, if there's a non-compliance with the regulations, you're still going to have to apply for a report and consent.
All right, fantastic. Okay, question 2, when there are existing structures on an adjoining allotment, such as verandas or gazebos, do you include the shadows cast by these structures when preparing shadow diagrams under Regulation 83? And I'll just include alfrescos because I know that one came up a bit as well.
Yep, thanks again to the attendee who sent in that question. We did touch a little on it in the webinar. However, I'll repeat the answer again. Verandas, gazebos, pergolas, and alfrescos can be excluded when preparing shadow diagrams under Regulation 83. This is because the definition of recreational private open space means any part of a private open space, and these structures meet the definition of private open space because it includes a deck, terrace, patio, balcony, pergola, veranda, gazebo, swimming pool, or spa. An alfresco is basically a veranda. It's just a new name that's used for a veranda.
Yep, very good. It's complicated, the alfresco, because I guess it shares the same roof line, but still under our interpretation, that would not be included. So one to note.
Yeah, look, it's basically because the recreational private open space would be overshadowing itself, and that's not the intent of the regulations. The regulations is to determine the shadow of the proposed building affecting the recreational private open space, not the recreational private open space affecting itself.
Yep, got it. All right, question 3, the final question. Can the Class 10A building, such as a shed, be built on a vacant allotment under Regulation 87?
Yes, it actually can. So many people think that you can't build a Class 10A on a vacant allotment and a report and consent would be required, but that's not actually the case. The regulations were amended in the 2018 regulations, and the wording was changed. So what happened under Regulation 87, it says that a class building that is appurtenant to a building of another class must not be on the same allotment as the building of the other class. So basically, if the 10A is not appurtenant to another building, in other words, on a vacant allotment, a report and consent would not be required.
All right, thank you. Okay, well, look, thanks very much, Christian, for answering those questions and for the presentation. I'm hopeful this session's been valuable to our practitioners. And once again, thank you to all of you for attending, as well as providing some really great questions and some great feedback. As mentioned a few times, we'll collate all the unanswered questions and answer as many of them as possible, and get the answers out to you in the coming weeks. These webinars, they continue to be well intended. The attendance is increasing, so I hope that they're providing value to the industry. We'll be sending out a survey later today or tomorrow. So if you jump on that, we really do take on board your feedback in those surveys. So if there's anything different you want to see from us, please fill those out, and any feedback we'll take on board to try and produce these webinars to the best standard possible to help you, our practitioners. So if you want to find out more about our practitioner education series webinars and when they'll be held, you can visit our website, and you can keep an eye out for emails and all these. Thank you very much for attending, and we'll see you later.
Thank you.